So, here are two images from two films that have come out recently that have been called pretty feminist and girl powery. When I ask you to think about an empowered woman, though, which one would you first go to? My guess is that it's this one. For those of you maybe not in the know, this is Wonder Woman. She was DC's first female superhero to have her own solo film, which was crazy successful, both in terms of box office stats and critical reviews. This is Lady Bird, the title character of a drama comedy that's about a lot of things. Although it's mostly a coming-of-age movie, it's also a movie about a turbulent mother-daughter relationship, small towns, longing, independence, and it's also a movie about a girl and her terrible decisions. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about. Dumb girls, or specifically, dumb girls in film. Bear with me. I am about to throw some minor criticism at the industry, so before I do that, I'd like to give it some credit where credit is due. We've made a lot of really good changes recently. Not only are more women and minorities working in the field, but we've seen more new and innovative storytelling being produced in general. Different types of people are being placed at the center of stories, and a lot of these stories are really good. But despite these all-around changes and more that I didn't mention, I've still felt a lack of women as fully fleshed out characters in film. Now, when I describe fully fleshed out characters, I'm talking about characters with agency. In most stories, even when they're the main characters or the protagonists, women lack agency. Instead of making decisions that affect their eventual outcomes, things are always happening to them. A common trope is for a woman to act as a foil to a man with agency in a story. She could be his conscience. She could be the voice inside his head, the woman he gets to come home to at the end of the day, the girlfriend holding him back, the temptation. When they do have agency, it's often punished. So there's your context. But what does that have to do with either of the two movies I just showed you? Okay, I watched Lady Bird when it first came out in 2017. And at this point, I was a freshman, and I already considered myself to be pretty conscious of gender and its presentation in media, and super smart and progressive, the way a lot of really pretentious 14-year-olds tend to think that they are. And I still really dislike the main character because throughout this whole movie, she's rash, she's abrasive, she makes so many decisions that just showcase a complete lapse in judgment. She's a very flawed person. So I left the theater loving the movie, but hating the protagonist. It was after a little reflection that I wasn't used to seeing women get to have flaws. We often forget that being given agency also means being given autonomy that's needed in order to make some pretty bad decisions. We don't really get to see women make these terrible decisions or to see the reality of their flaws because, as I've said, women are so often passive players in their own stories. We're relegated to being accessories to bigger, brighter plots, usually those that center the lives of men. But what was so off-putting specifically about Lady Bird? Okay, to talk about this, I have to talk about something that's going to put some of you, half of you, a little bit on edge. Let's talk about the male gaze. Now, before I get into this, I want to address a common misconception about the male gaze, that it means any movie made by a man is man-hating, is woman-hating, and completely full of the male gaze, and any movie made by a woman is revolutionarily feminist and lacks the male gaze totally. And that's just not true. I could name 10 exceptions to that off the top of my head. The male gaze is just a term coined by feminist film critic Laura Mulvey to describe a sexual inequality between men and women, specifically in cinema, in which women are simultaneously looked at and displayed so that they can be said to connote to be looked at-ness. Essentially, the male gaze is a term for the characterization of women in film as kind of just there, where their primary function is to be aesthetically consumed. And even when women are empowered, it tends to follow a specific brand of empowerment. An especially common trope of late is the badass. And while I do love a good kick-ass protagonist, that's often all that these types of characters really get to be. That brings us back to Wonder Woman. I am about to throw minor criticism in the direction of this movie, so there's your warning. But Wonder Woman's great. She's strong, she's capable, she's intelligent, and it felt really good to watch a woman be the first line of defense. But in a way, her design is still very much catered to some ideal, going back to this idea of the male gaze, but that isn't actually my biggest personal issue with the movie. Wonder Woman is very lacking in flaw. Her only real flaw is never-ending righteousness, which isn't really a flaw as much as it is an admirable personality trait that can get in the way of things sometimes. Now you could say, well, she's a superhero. She's following the traditional superhero's journey. A lot of superheroes are annoyingly perfect. And that's true. However, when you're talking about strong women in popular film, you're already working with a low content base. And superhero movies are one of the few genres of movie that's recently been reliably pumping out female protagonists. And Wonder Woman is still one of many characters with this issue, being that they have very few of them. So let's contrast her with Lady Bird. Lady Bird is not the strong, smart woman you think about when you talk about an empowered woman. She's just not. She makes many mistakes, most of which are propelled by her own character flaws, like her impulsive self-absorption. She ditches her family's Thanksgiving to go hang out with her wealthy boyfriend and drives a stake between herself and her mother. She vandalizes a nun's car to gain popularity and then drops her best friend, who she's had for years. And through all of this, we're still supposed to be on her side as an audience. And she grows, and she makes amends to these mistakes by the end of the movie. And I still disliked her when I first watched it. Later, I realized that the way women's narratives had been so often force-fed to me in my growing up had led me to be completely taken aback and a little repelled by women characters who were flawed and dumb and human sometimes. Lady Bird definitely doesn't just exist to be looked at. She's a crucial element to her own story and a challenge to the viewers who are supposed to be on her side but have to deal with her questionable choices. So you might be thinking, okay, but why do we want to see girls be stupid? Isn't this the age of smart, go-getting women? Why should we actively want to see them making irresponsible choices? Good question. I've been comparing Wonder Woman and Lady Bird a lot through this movie, through this talk. However, I want to make it clear right now that I don't believe that either one is actually inherently better than the other for women. They both bring different ideas to the table for women and movies in general. I am, however, going to argue that the film market right now is kind of saturated with this Wonder Woman type of character. Smart, independent badasses, relatively without flaw. And we should want to see more of the Lady Bird type of character. Loud, demanding, making us feel kind of funny about rooting for them sometimes, because that's a really real and relatable way for a person to be. And while there's certainly no shortage of flawed protagonists in film, they've overwhelmingly been men and underwhelmingly women or minorities. And there's a reason we should want this type of representation for all sorts of people. I believe movies, as a form of media with a huge impact in our culture specifically, have a way of humanizing and creating empathy. We feel a connection with the people we're viewing on screen. And how can we avoid that when so much of the art of film lies in creating that connection between watcher and character? If women are so passive and or perfect all the time, we stop being able to root for them when they're not. And that can and does have real-world implications. So I've ranted at you about women in film now for like 8 minutes. I've used the word flawed maybe 30 times. So you might be thinking, now what? Like, what do we do? I know that I can't expect an auditorium full of high schoolers to go out into the world as soon as this is over and make a bunch of gender-conscious films and submit them to the Sundance Film Festival. It's not what I'm here to do. In fact, I'm not even here to suggest that the only women in film from now on should be those with flaws. We like badasses. There's a reason they make so much money. We should be able to watch them without feeling guilty about it. However, I do want to create a more conscious awareness of what we're watching right now that could morph into, at the very least, a more intentional rejection of the things that are being handed to us. And lastly, I'd like you to remember that this isn't really a very radical take, and it boils down to just a reminder that girls can be, and are, very dumb too. Thank you.